everybody. Welcome to the last live stream I'm doing for 2018. My name is Brian Robinson. I'm with Code Contemporary. We're going to be talking today about a decent bit of CSS Grid, and so I want to make sure that if you do have any questions that go ahead and post that on the side of the screen in the chat. I'll answer as many of those as I can as we go through things. And then if you are tuning in after the fact, make sure to go ahead and click on the subscribe button down below and hit that little notification alert area to make sure that you get notified every time I go live, which is hopefully going to be once a week on Wednesday mornings at 10 a.m. Central Time. So yeah, just make sure that you're up to date on all that. Also, I'm going to be doing a full paid course on CSS Grid coming in January. So you can see there's some links down below in the stream. Codecontemporary.com is where you can sign up to get 50% off my Grid course when it comes out in January. And then also I post a lot of stuff about Grid on my personal site, briannlrobinson.com. So yeah, that's kind of my spiel to begin with, but we're going to go ahead and dive in and start talking about the basics of Grid. So if you haven't actually played with this functionality yet, it's really, really impressive what we can do in the grand scheme of the web now in terms of layout. So let's see, get this playing. So yeah, codecontemporary.com, practical grid is what I'm working towards. So what is CSS Grid? CSS Grid is a new piece of default built-in CSS functionality. It is not a third-party framework. It's not a bootstrap. It's not a foundation. It is CSS that allows you to work on your layout in a way that makes the most sense in terms of there are fewer quirks. You're not using floats, which were never meant to be used for complex layouts. It really allows for developers to write incredibly easy CSS layouts for designs that we've had in the past, and it's also opening up a lot of new doors for the way that designers can behave in the future. We can do a lot more two-dimensional layout as opposed to just working in just standard rows going all the way down. We can actually place things and expand things across multiple rows and columns at the same time. That's really, kind of the big mindset shift that's going to happen in a lot of designers' methodologies to actually start utilizing this functionality the best. But the great thing about Grid is it allows for us to do traditional layouts much, much easier as well. And that's what I'm going to show you today a little bit. This isn't necessarily as easy as just tossing display flex on something and hey, look, it automatically lines up in a row. But once you master a few new properties, you'll be creating these new designs really in record time. You can do prototype layouts in no time flat. Let's see. Come on, Keynote. There we go. So I do want to talk about a few definitions before we dive into code. Almost as much as anything, Grid is going to require us to have a new mindset for the way we work. Because instead of working from the content out, so like Flexbox would do, you put flex on something and it's automatically going to size to the size of the content first. It's very, very good at that. Grid really works from that layout back in. So you define your layout, which is kind of an amorphous thing because it doesn't actually have any elements in it, and then you flow your content into that layout. So we have to talk about some generic terms so that we're all working from the same vocabulary first. First, this is kind of the more obvious one. The grid container is what we're actually going to define display grid on. It's going to allow every child inside of it to become a grid item. A grid item is simply just every element inside that's a direct descendant of the grid container. This includes even things like pseudo elements. So if you put an after element on your grid container, you will actually have that in line as one of your grid items. So a grid doesn't do much on its own. You need to also define your grid lines. And so each grid that is defined is actually just a series of vertical and horizontal lines. They create the implicit spaces that form our rows and our columns, which in Grid we generically refer to as a grid track. that's defined by two parallel lines. So that's either going to be two adjacent lines being a row and two vertical adjacent lines being a column. A grid cell is defined by the four adjacent grid row and grid column lines. So it's literally just one small segment of your grid. And then a bigger version of that is the grid area. Grid area is the total space between four, can be adjacent but doesn't have to be adjacent grid lines. So two vertical, two horizontal grid lines will make for one grid area. So today I want to walk through two main things. We're going to set up a simple grid for an article layout, and we're going to then take that and turn it into a fluid grid that works responsively with no breakpoints. So we're going to talk about attaching display grid to the parent, using grid template columns to define what our grid will actually look like. We're introducing a new unit in CSS called the FR unit, the fractional unit. We're going to use grid gap to actually put the space in between our grid instead of using margins. And then we're going to use two new functions in CSS called min, max, and repeat to get us our cool, fluid layout with no breakpoints. So unless there are any other questions before I dive directly into code, and as you can see, we're going to work in CodePen today, we are going to go ahead and start laying out an article grid inside of CodePen. So I want to walk you through the HTML a little bit real fast. Up here we've got a card container, and that's going to be our grid container. And then each of these article cards has a headline, an image inside of it, a little description, and a button. And then we're going to apply just a little bit of default styling just to make them look a little bit better, bigger font size. We got like a drop shadow, a button with a hover state, that sort of thing. Nothing that's going to affect our layout. Because in fact, you can see over here on the left-hand side that we have very little in terms of layout yet. Each of these is a block level element, which means that it wants to just take up 100% width of the screen and kind of be stacked going down the page. That's kind of the default way that the web really does want to work. But we're going to change all of that in just a few short lines of code. So we're going to have our card container selector, and this is just a class. And I'm going to apply display grid to this container. I save that in, and you'll notice on the left-hand side of the screen, nothing has really changed. And that's because we haven't actually defined our grid. We've just given this parent element a grid context. So what we need to now do is define grid lines. And that is going to be using either grid template columns or grid template rows. In our case, we don't need to worry about rows yet. We just need to worry about the columns. So we're going to define grid template columns. I'm going to just define hard-coded pixel values right now so I can show you a little bit more about what this is actually doing. So we'll create three 300 pixel columns. And you can see automatically grid is going to flow all of our content into that grid. So I'm actually going to go ahead and come into Firefox to take a look at this in the full view. And I find it's really often best to be working in Firefox. They have the best grid inspector tools. Just no argument. I can't imagine anyone that would think otherwise. And as you can see, I can actually come into this layout panel in the DevTools in Firefox, and I can select the grid that I want to visualize. And you can see we now have 3 columns, and we have 4 rows. And you might know I didn't specify any template rows, and Grid actually creates what we call implicit rows for anything that I don't define. So if I have extra content, it's not just going to stop my layout, it's going to keep adding that content along the columns for any additional rows that it finds. You can see here the Firefox Grid Inspector also gives us the number of our grid lines. And so what I really did inside the code is specify a line in between each of these. Line 1, line 2, line 3, and it ends at line 4. you don't actually have to put this in here, although you can name your lines however you would like to, and there's a lot of cool use cases that use that. But for the most part, it implicitly adds numeric line numbers starting at before your first value. Sorry, over here, before your first value and ending after your last one. So I'm going to go ahead and undo that. We don't actually need those line names in there. Save that in, and as you can see, we now have a non-fluid grid. This works out pretty well. We've defined that out. I'm going to change these over to percentage values so you can see how easy it is to go ahead and say these are each 33%. Save that in. And now you can see it is 100% fluid and sizes down as far as it can. And it gets pretty awkward down there at the bottom. And we can take a look over in Firefox. And you can see that works over here as well. We do have a little additional space. It's really hard to see, but obviously 33% is not a full third, and that's going to create a little awkward white space at the end. And that's where the new unit comes in. That's the fractional unit. So in Flexbox methodology, you would, on each of your children elements, add in a flex value, right? A flex grow, flex shrink value, and that's just a standard numeric value. 1, 2, 3, any integer really. In grid, since we're defining that on our columns and our rows in our parent, we can't just say 1, 1, 1 because obviously that a unitless value is going to be confusing in the end to the browser. And so what we have in the specification and in browsers is the FR unit, and that's the fractional unit of the white space available, and it's going to evenly split that up amongst all of our grid columns. Now in this case, we could very easily change this to this middle one to 2, and you can see we automatically get that middle column to be wider, 2 times as wide as the other columns. But we want 3 even columns, and you can see now we save this in, and as we go through it, we get that third value without using percentages, which would be not based in good true math. And so in the end, we're going to revisit this in the next little bit. But first, I want to go ahead and add spacing in between each of these columns and rows. And in the past, what we would have done is we would have, on our card class, given a margin right of 1 rem. It would automatically add that spacing, but it also adds that spacing to the end. And so then we have to go in and we have to define, card nth child 3n and margin right 0, and it loses that space. But then every time we want to change the number of columns we have to go back in and adjust that nth child recipe. So grid allows us to use the new property grid gap, and in future versions of browsers we're going to have just a standard gap value, which will also work in Flexbox, but that's still being spec'd out right now. And I can specify grid column gap or grid row gap. I can say, let's say 2 rem, and this is going to add a space in between each column, and I can do the same thing on a row and get the spacing in between each row. But there is a handy shorthand for grid column and grid row gap, and that's just the grid gap value, which also allows you to specify 2 units if you want. And you can see you can have your row gap and then your column gap, and or just one value to put the same amount on all sides. So you can see now we have an evenly spaced grid that has nice space in between and allows for a pretty decent responsive flow. If I wanted to make this tablet and mobile friendly, I would need to still come in and define out breakpoints. And so I could very easily come in and I could say, at media, max width of 768 pixels. We're going to set our grid template columns. Instead of 3 1FRs, we could specify 2. It would help if I had selector in here, because that's how the internet works. I get so used to working in Sass that I sometimes forget when I'm working or trying to do demos in static CSS. There we go. So now when we get into the 768 range, it automatically breaks into 2. But then we'd have to come in and we'd have to add a breakpoint around the mobile view as well. And this is starting to get a little bit more convoluted than I'd like. And so in the end, what we can do, and what Grid allows us to do, is specify repeat values and a min-max value, which together are going to create these breakpoints for us. So I'm going to come in, and instead of 1fr 3 times, I'm going to use the repeat function, which takes a unit, just a simple integer, how many times you want this value to repeat, and then the value itself. So now we're back to 3 columns of 1fr, but I've used a shorthand to kind of get us there. I've used this function, and if we wanted, instead of 3, we want 4, we change that one value, and we get that moving up. Again, we would still need a breakpoint to make this work, so we don't necessarily want to just stick with this. We're going to specify a min-max value for our column size instead of just that hard-coded 1fr. So I'm going to use the min-max function, fr. And as you can see, it goes a little wonky because we haven't actually told it to adjust the size of our grid based on how many will fit. And so instead of 4 in my repeat function, I'm going to take a value of auto fill. And as you can see, at various sizes, we now have 1, 2, 3, or if we get even bigger and go back to our Firefox window and close out Inspector, we'll have 4 across. And we can actually shrink this down, and it automatically is going to fill up the space that each of these can take up, going from that 320 pixel or 360 pixel value up to 1fr. So every time a card isn't going to fit inside of 360 pixels wide, it's going to automatically take off one column and reflow our content. So that's really the basics and kind of some of the power of these new pieces of functionality in Grid. It is super powerful in a lot of ways. It gives us a lot of new flexibility and gives us some old designs in an easier way. So if there are any questions, I'd be happy to go ahead and talk through those. Or if not, we can start talking maybe a little bit about specifying rows and columns. Or we can just call it a day, and I'll see you in the new year. Does anybody have any questions for how this is working? Cool. Well, unless there are any questions, I think we should just go ahead and call it a day. Spent about 23 minutes talking y'all through the basics of CSS Grid. You've got display grid to allow for the grid context on your parent. You can see we didn't actually do anything on our children items. We didn't have to because we want our layout to be the end-all be-all, and we want the items to flow into that layout. There are properties we can use on each child, and maybe we'll get into that in the new year. Maybe the second Tuesday or the second Wednesday of January, we'll talk more about that. But then we also defined our grid with grid template columns. It can take any number of units separated by spaces, and that's going to create a number of columns that will allow for your content to flow into it. And then we spaced them out nicely with the grid gap property. And we specified 2 rem, which is the grid row and grid gap values combined. And then we refactored that from hard-coded values into the min-max function and the repeat function with autofill. Autofit would work as well. There's not a huge amount of difference. It's just how it handles the white space. And then we had a nice article grid that was evenly spaced and worked at multiple screen sizes without any breakpoints. So this is all the kind of the simplest aspects of Grid. It gets much more complicated the bigger designs you want to do, but with that power comes a lot of cool stuff that we can do. So yeah, I'd really appreciate if you're watching this after the fact, or even if you're watching it right now, if you could go and hit that subscribe button, hit the notification. I'm going to be making more and more videos in the coming year. And if you're interested in learning bigger things around Grid, go take a look at codecontemporary.com. I'll put a link in the description as well to check out the course that should be up and running in January. I'm going to try to keep it as inexpensive as possible. It's going to be about 2 or 3 hours of content that's going to get you up and running in a practical way with CSS Grid. I show a few different 5 different design patterns that you can actually utilize just by copying and pasting the code if you want, but also teach you the various properties involved with dealing with Grid. Anyway, if there are no questions, I'm going to go ahead and say thanks for stopping by. I'm going to see you in the new year, and I hope you keep doing some cool code experiments, especially over the holidays.